All right. Okay. So, hi, my name's Lewis. I work for a place called the Cooperative AI Foundation. I'm also finishing up my PhD at Oxford at the moment. And yeah, because this is a relatively short talk, I just want to kind of throw out some kind of rough kind of like little kind of conceptual taxonomy that I've been using to think about different sorts of problems within the kind of AI safety space at the moment. And I'm going to frame this in terms of this thing called delegation games. So what's a delegation game? Well, I'm basically using this to describe a kind of multi-principle, multi-agent problem. So you might have a set of principles, so in this case humans, delegating to a set of agents, in this case maybe robots, AI systems. And for simplicity in this kind of really kind of short kind of conceptual overview, I'm going to assume that only agents are acting. So humans delegate to agents, the agents go off and do something in the world on behalf of the humans, and this goes better or worse for the humans, depending on what those agents do. I'm also going to assume there's this kind of one-to-one thing between this principal and this agent. And I'm also going to assume, just for this kind of like, yeah, semi-technical but kind of mostly conceptual exposition, that the agents are playing some simultaneous move, single-shot game as modeled by a normal form game. So very kind of like quickly, formally, you can model this by thinking about just one set of strategies which are available to the agents and two sets of utility functions, the principals and the agents. So here's the agent game, here's the principal game. They're exactly the same. You have exactly the same strategies in both, but the payoffs are slightly different. Okay. And I'm going to use this to kind of like formalize these distinctions along some lines that I'll talk about in just a second. Okay. So when we think about things that can go wrong in this setting, and here's the setting again, so we have some principals at the top, we have some agents at the bottom, and then they have the agents doing some stuff, interacting maybe, then there's at least two different ways in which this can go wrong. The first is this classic problem of control, right? And so is my AI system doing what I want it to do? And we can break this down along a couple of axes again, which is related to this idea of the orthogonality thesis, which some of you may have heard of. So first of all, there are problems that come from preferences. So is my agent actually aligned with what I want it to do? This is a relatively thin notion of alignment here that I'm using instead of the thicker general notion of alignment and control more generally. But we can also then think about capabilities and think about the individual capabilities of an agent. So my agent might want the same thing that I want, but if they're really, not very good at getting it, then they're not going to do exactly what I want. And the second sort of thing that can go wrong, which I think is relatively understudied, is this kind of cooperation problem as well. And I think you can make a similar move actually by breaking this down into problems around preferences and capabilities. So the first we might think about kind of collective alignment. And so this basically defines kind of, are we playing a zero-sum game? Are we playing a team game? Are we playing something in between? And so on. We can think about measuring and quantifying that. And then we can also think beyond this about cooperative capabilities. And this is the kind of focus of the Cooperative AI Foundation, which is where I work, and some of the work that I've been doing more recently. And so then just before moving on, the right question you should be asking yourselves right now is like, so what? So I can break these things down into these kind of different buckets or whatever. Why is this useful? Well, I think it's useful as a kind of conceptual and kind of deconfusion tool, which I've been using to talk about what I mean by, say, cooperative capabilities, or the difference between this sort of alignment and this sort of alignment, for instance, which I'll go into in just a second. And I also think it's important because most of the work that we've been seeing in AI safety so far has been focusing on this kind of single agent, kind of principal agent problem of control. And I think, in fact, we're going to need to start thinking much more about these cooperation problems pretty soon as we start to enter a multipolar world where more and more AI systems are deployed by more and more actors, and they are interacting with each other on behalf of humans at speeds and at scales that we can't currently deal with very easily. Okay, so in the remainder of the talk then, I'm just going to really quickly sketch out some kind of metrics for these sorts of things. And you might think like, okay, why metrics? I think it's useful to kind of formally think about these sorts of things to clarify them. I also think that metrics can be useful in kind of the paradigm that currently kind of is dominant within AI and so on, where things are driven by evals, things are driven by benchmarks, things are driven by you get what you measure, etc. And so I think there's kind of useful things for that, although I don't think it's enough. Okay, so I'll do that in the context of normal form games. And first looking at kind of control failures. So again, control is my agent doing what I want it to. And to measure alignment, we can think about basically the difference between utility functions. There are some kind of tricky things here because utility functions, the same different utility functions can encode different sets of preferences. So you have to do some kind of normalization thing first by affine linear transformation. And then you can kind of end up taking kind of weighted norms between utility functions. And there's some interesting work on this that's recently been done in the context of RL2. To measure individual capabilities, I think the easiest way to think about this is, again, to first normalize each utility function, but then to think about the proportion of the utility that the agent gets in terms of the best it could possibly get, which is related to this idea of an approximate equilibrium or approximate Nash equilibrium. And once you kind of formalize things in this way, then there's a load of kind of basic and very, very intuitive results that just fall out kind of instantly about the fact that kind of, cool, if I'm maximally misaligned, then I have exactly the opposite preference ordering and so on. Likewise, if I'm exactly similarly aligned, I have exactly the same preference ordering. And you can kind of do things like bounding the degree of the welfare that the principals get based on these sorts of quantities. But clearly, control is not enough. This kind of thing is not enough for high principal welfare, which is what we care about at the end of the day in the multi-agent setting, because you can easily get things that arise like the prisoner's dilemma, where the games that the agents are playing and the principals want them to play are exactly the same, but we end up in these bad equilibrium. So this motivates the study of kind of cooperation failures more generally. So cooperation, are the agents achieving high joint welfare? That's how I'm going to describe this. And again, we can think about this as an alignment thing. So using a really similar idea to before, then we can basically take a set of utility functions, we can compute some kind of centroid from those, we can normalize both of them, and again, we can take some distances between them and aggregate those distances. It kind of quantifies, in some sense, how disparate these different utility functions might be, and therefore to what extent the agents are on the same team, so to speak. Another thing that I think is slightly more interesting is to try and measure cooperative capabilities as distinct from individual capabilities. And I'm going to use a similar idea to before, where instead of talking about kind of individual kind of payoffs and so on, I'm going to talk about joint welfare. And I'm going to say that one way we might want to think of this is to compute something first that looks a bit like the price of anarchy, where the price of anarchy measures the difference between the welfare that we could get if, for instance, I could just tell all my agents to do exactly one thing and I just want to maximize welfare, and the difference between what will happen in the worst Nash equilibrium. So it's kind of measures the kind of price of kind of competitiveness, price of selfishness, as I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this notion. And then again, you can kind of measure the fraction of the welfare loss that is avoided by the agents jointly. And again, you have a bunch of nice things that fall out from this. But then I think, it's also kind of clear that collective alignment, so just simply being on the same team, is also not enough. And so we actually do need some cooperative capabilities. So the easiest way to see this is just that you can run into equilibrium selection problems, right? So here's a really good equilibrium, here's a bad equilibrium, they're both equilibria. But it's actually really, really easy to construct a simple game where there in fact is only one Nash equilibrium, and it's arbitrarily bad in terms of welfare for the principals. It's basically a variant of what's known as the traveler's dilemma, and it's not too complicated. Okay, so just sketched a bunch of extremely high level and relatively crude kind of concepts here to start measuring these things and thinking about them. But kind of what are the next steps from this? I think the obvious thing is that in reality we clearly don't know the game that agents are playing, and so we want to kind of measure these things or infer these things or think about these things from data generated by agents, which has applications in a bunch of things, so multi-agent RL, mechanism design, other things. I think it's also useful for thinking about evals, and at the moment, one of the things we're doing along some lines is that we're running a contest with some folks at MIT and at DeepMind based on this melting pot kind of suite of kind of multi-agent RL environments, where we're kind of trying to incentivize cooperation. In order to incentivize something, we need to actually have some kind of, at least vaguely kind of formal, high-level definition of what it means for the agents to be cooperating. So that's it. If you have any thoughts, questions, suggestions, come and find me, come and say hi. That's it. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks. We have time for a question. Yeah, go for it.
I'm still trying to understand how agents can have different motivations than their principals. Or aren't they implemented by their principals to perform exactly the right thing?
So many systems are, but things like machine learning systems, which are just kind of built from data and just, I guess you were saying before you made this example about the citation kind of generator that generates spurious citations. That presumably is not, in fact, what the people who built that system wanted it to do. So they would love it if it, in fact, spat out the correct citations and was very good at providing that reasoning. But they don't know how to make it do that yet. And so I think this is, that's the general problem.
Okay, wonderful. Well, now, what is your challenge? What do you want other people to solve?
Cool. So my challenge, which I didn't really allude to so much in this talk, but is something else that I've actually just started thinking about recently, which is about preventing collusion between machine learning agents, basically. And I think this is the kind of flip side of cooperation. This is cooperation when we don't want cooperation to happen. And so if anyone has any ideas for how to prevent collusion in the context of machine learning systems, either by detecting it, mechanism design, that sort of stuff, then come and talk to me. So I think that's important. And yeah, we don't have good ideas to how to do this yet.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Louis.